On October 12th, the US airbase in Ramstein, Germany, will host a meeting for 50 countries that publicly support Ukraine in its war with Russia. The meeting will also include Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is expected to release the details of his Ukraine victory plan. President Zelensky has presented the plan to several Western leaders, including President Biden, Vice President Harris, former President Trump, and NATO General Secretary Rutte. Several other officials have received briefings on the details of the plan, with the intention of collaborating with key allies to refine them before the final rollout on October 12th. Unnamed officials have expressed disappointment in the plan's current form, stating that it lacks a clear path to victory or peace. This raises the open question of what peace will look like if the Ukrainian leader does not provide a pathway to initiate peace talks. Following the disappointment of the June Swiss Peace Conference, President Zelensky expressed his hope for Russia's attendance at the next peace conference. The biggest flaw in the Swiss Peace Conference was the absence of an invitation to Russia or a country representing Russia's interests. President Zelensky has embarked on a public relations campaign to garner support from neutral parties and Russia's allies, including China, with the aim of pressuring Russia to participate in the next peace conference, scheduled to begin in November. As it continues to push further into eastern Ukraine, Russia has not yet agreed to participate in the next peace conference scheduled to begin in November. Despite its slow progress and heavy casualties, Russia has stated that it does not see a serious peace plan in which to hold talks with Ukraine. It was hoped that the Ukraine victory plan would establish a path to initiate peace talks by November, a goal that the 10-point peace plan failed to achieve. The details revealed indicate that Ukraine doesn't offer a route for peace negotiations, but rather proposes a strategy to conclude the conflict before the incoming US president's term begins in January. This timeline is absurd in and of itself, and it also undermines the original plan to initiate peace talks in November. The known Ukraine victory plan calls for requesting more weapons, obtaining permission to use them against targets within Russia, and extending NATO membership. None of these points, also considered red lines for Russia, guarantee victory or appear to lack a clear strategy for achieving it. The apparent thinking in Ukraine is that the victory plan will motivate them to engage in negotiations, with the 10-point peace plan serving as the roadmap for peace talks. For this to be possible, Ukraine must deliver a series of catastrophic defeats to Russia, and the West must tighten its sanctions on Russia, and most likely China, to compel them to accept negotiations on a plan they have already rejected. The victory plan also instills hope in the Ukrainian population by providing guarantees of NATO and European Union membership in exchange for their sacrifice in sustaining the war. Below is the outline of what Ukraine wants Russia to agree to before initiating peace talks. Ukraine's 10-point peace plan. Nuclear safety, especially that of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Food security for Asian and African countries. Energy security and restoration of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, release of all prisoners and the return of Ukrainian children deported to Russia. Restoration of the Russia-Ukraine border to that prior to the 2014 annexation of Crimea, per the UN Charter. Full withdrawal of Russian military forces from Ukraine and cessation of hostilities. Prosecution of war crimes in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, including the creation of a special tribunal for Russian war crimes, assessment of ecological damage, including that caused by the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, prosecution of those responsible, recovery and reconstruction, guarantees against future Russian aggression, a multilateral peace conference with a legally binding international treaty. The 10-point peace plan is not a blueprint for peace talks, but a list of demands that Russia must agree to prior to negotiations to end the war in a negotiated settlement. This includes the withdrawal of Russian forces prior to talks commencing. Germany, which lost World War I, was allowed to continue to occupy parts of France that it had captured while the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated. This demonstrates how unusual it is to require a withdrawal from occupied territory without experiencing a significant military setback. The points that would be open to negotiation are Ukraine's NATO and European Union membership, and since Russia would have withdrawn from Ukraine, they would have no real leverage to stop either. This 10-point peace plan treats Russia as the vanquished and gives them no point to negotiate, so it is understandable from their perspective why they would never agree to it. There are other potential peace plans besides the Ukraine one. Just before the start of the Swiss Peace Conference in June, Russia created an even more ridiculous plan than the Ukraine one. It stated two main points. The Russian peace plan: Ukraine will withdraw its troops from territories partially occupied by Russia, including Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukraine should abandon its plans to join NATO before the commencement of peace talks. No nation, including most Russians, took the Russian peace plan seriously, as it was essentially a call for Ukraine to surrender. During the September 2024 United Nations General Assembly meeting, 17 nations discussed China's 6-point peace plan, which they had transformed into a China-Brazil plan. President Zelensky called the plan destructive and a political statement, and complained that Ukraine was not included in the peace proposal process, which is full of irony after the Ukraine War Swiss Peace Conference, with a bold statement of, "How can you offer 'here is our initiative' without asking anything from us?" He asserted that the plan was pro-Russian, citing its final point as a likely reference to Ukraine's exclusion from NATO and the European Union, and suggesting an incentive for Ukraine to join the Russian and Chinese-dominated BRICS alliance. Russian President Putin, for his part, stated that the Brazil-China peace plan is something he would be open to, and agreed that China, Brazil and India could all be acceptable mediators of the plan. China-Brazil peace plan. Russia and Ukraine should refrain from expanding the battlefield, escalating the fighting, or engaging in provocation. Resumption of direct dialogue and a push for de-escalation until a ceasefire is achieved. China and Brazil call for an international peace conference recognized and attended by both Russia and Ukraine. Increased humanitarian assistance to affected regions. There should be no use of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. No attacks on nuclear facilities. Dividing the world into isolated political or economic groups should be opposed. Instead, international cooperation on energy, currency, finance, trade, food security, and security of critical infrastructure should be supported. The sub-bullet of an international peace conference recognized by both Russia and Ukraine was an obvious reference to the Swiss Peace Conference, which is a legitimate goal since any peace conference needs to have both parties involved. The wording of the goal is going to be viewed as a veiled insult to Ukraine and will be viewed as being pro-Russian, since President Zelensky is sensitive about the overall criticism of the Swiss Peace Conference format of not including Russia. The fear that Russian attacks on Ukraine's shipping and dock facilities would prevent Ukrainian agriculture products from shipping out of the Black Sea motivated African nations to initiate peace talks to end the war. The absence of Ukrainian grain could cause dramatic food price increases in a relatively poor region, putting economic and social pressure on countries that are vulnerable. The leaders were less concerned about famine. Africa Peace Plan. South Africa, Egypt, Senegal, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Comoros, Zambia and Uganda. Russia and Ukraine's sovereignty to be recognized. Unhindered grain exports must be continued. There is a need to de-escalate the fighting and initiate peace negotiations. There will be a release of prisoners of war and an increase in humanitarian aid. Despite not ending the war, the Turkish-led Black Sea Grain Initiative enabled the transportation of Ukrainian agricultural products out of the Black Sea without Russian attacks. This agreement also facilitated the passage of Russian ships carrying agricultural products. Despite the later revocation of this agreement, Ukraine collaborated with other Black Sea countries to transport its grain through their territorial waters. This meant that Russia could not attack Ukraine's ships in another country's territorial waters, as it would be considered an act of war, and all three countries that allowed territorial water transport are members of NATO. Turkey was involved in negotiations to end the war in March 2022, and it led talks with both parties, including face-to-face discussions. The talks appeared to be close to a breakthrough when then United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky to convince him to reject the deal and continue to fight. The deal fell apart once Ukraine backed out after the Johnson meeting. The Turkish-led initiative has been mentioned by President Putin as a good framework for peace, but it was negotiated without Western representation and would have required the West, led by the US, to offer security guarantees to Ukraine. This was envisioned without any consultation with the West, so in its current form it probably would not work. At that time, the West appeared to be steering clear of direct negotiations with Russia regarding European security. President Putin's protests over the proposed NATO memberships for Ukraine and Georgia made them aware that he intended to renegotiate many of the post-Cold War agreements established by a politically and economically weak Russia emerging from the fall of Soviet communism. The West was reluctant to renegotiate these agreements, fearing that doing so after the invasion of Ukraine would reward Russia for its invasion. Turkish President Erdogan has maintained favorable relations with both Russia and Ukraine even during the war. Ukraine has never rejected its peace proposal, and President Putin has repeatedly mentioned it as a blueprint for peace. While it does offer the security guarantees Ukraine seeks, it does so without NATO membership, making it a potential peace plan should the West decide to engage in peace talks with Russia. The likelihood of the West participating in peace talks has increased compared to 2022. However, Russia has rejected the idea of Turkey mediating peace talks to end the war, despite its efforts to promote peace. This is not a deal-breaker, as the European Union, the United States and NATO would not want Turkey to lead the talks, especially after Turkey is in discussions to join the BRICS, which is led by Russia and China. The ongoing Russian advances in eastern Ukraine and the disappointment with the details of the Ukraine victory plan, which we expect to learn more about next week, seem to diminish the likelihood of peace. This may not be the case, as it seems that both sides have unofficially agreed that India possesses the necessary stature to spearhead a peace initiative, even in the absence of a formal peace plan. Following the implementation of Eurobond partial debt forgiveness earlier this year, which was predicated on indications of a negotiated settlement in 2025 for the war, Fitch continues to maintain this view in its creditworthiness score for Ukraine. Early in 2024, Ukraine's intelligence indicated that a negotiated settlement was likely to occur in 2025. Germany, the economic powerhouse of the European Union, is also advocating for immediate peace talks and a negotiated settlement to conclude the war. This will likely influence EU policy regarding the war, particularly as a politically weakened French President Macron cannot assume a more prominent role. Based on his recent trip to Ukraine, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte stands out as an outlier, advocating for the expansion of Western weapons to penetrate deeper into Russia and for NATO to adopt a more aggressive stance. It's possible that he is attempting to act as a military advisor, but ultimately, he lacks political authority and will not have a say in the political settlement of the war. The most likely factor that will determine the direction of peace talks will be the US elections, with both candidates having distinct differences on conditions on when and how to start peace talks.